All right, welcome to another edition of AP U.S. History, University High School. We are in chapter 24, chapter 25-ish. Anyway, the foreign policy of the 1920s and 30s. And there's really one word that you need to know. You need to associate this foreign policy as, and that's isolationism, and then a whole lot of events that happen underneath that isolationism. And then later on, through the late 1930s, certain leaders in America that were interventionists. So before we get into the 20s, though, the two camps, interventionists and isolationists. Interventionists, that is, those who believed that the United States should be instrumental in achieving collective security. So what you remember from what you remember after World War I, which American leaders were interested in establishing the U.S.'s role in achieving collective security for the whole globe. If you said President Wilson, you would be correct, and the League of Nations, which of course did not succeed. Sometimes business interests as well, who wanted to ensure that we had influence all around the world, so that we can achieve global trade as well. And then on the other side, those who favored disarmament, and they saw that one of the reasons that World War I, such a catastrophic war to end all wars, happened was because of militarization. So those that favored disarmament were isolationists, oftentimes nativists as well, who believed in American superiority and exceptionalism, and that we should, that we are superior and therefore not make alliances or meddle in the affairs of other nations. And just an anti-war movement. We know that there was a group of people that didn't want the United States to be involved in World War I as well, and that's going to be the case here in World War II as well. And especially on this side, the isolationists, especially Republicans, but also some Democrats, but many Republicans on the isolationist, disarmament side, and those that favored more of a U.S. stronger role in collective security were more Democrats on that side. So this is kind of a review. I'm going to fly through this. You remember Henry Cabot Lodge and his work to defeat the treaty that would have signed the United States on to the League of Nations. So he was an isolationist, refused to allow the U.S. to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and a security treaty with France was also rejected. So Henry Cabot Lodge, American isolationism. But let's move on to into the 20s now. There was a conference held at Washington, 1921, 1922. If you remember, the president at the time was Silent Cal, right? Calvin Coolidge. Wait, was it Warren G. Harding? Gosh, they're so interchangeable. Coolidge, Harding, Hoover. I mean, it's these three successive Republican presidents, and a lot of their policies were kind of similar in terms of foreign policy and then even economic policy. So the goals of this conference was, as it suggests, a naval disarmament, and also what the political situation was in the Far East. Remember, China had just experienced a civil war, right? Or a revolution in 1911, and they kicked out the Qing dynasty now, and now they're a republic. But they've got problems there, and especially as Japan is asserting itself a whole lot more and more, and they were pretty ticked off as well that they were not invited to the table of the Big Four at the Paris peace talks. The Japanese were. So in 1922, what followed? Oh, by the way, here they agreed upon like some treaty, naval treaty. We'll talk about here in a second. Actually, this is what came out of it, and it was a ratio. It was a battleship ratio that was achieved in this treaty. And the ratio was between these five powers: U.S., Britain, Japan, France, Italy. Notice Germany is not invited, of course, because the Treaty of Versailles forced them to disarm, right? And they couldn't rearm. That was one of the points in that treaty. Japan got a guarantee that the U.S. and Britain would stop fortifying their Far East territories as well, like the Philippines. And Britain also had Hong Kong and Burma, which is Myanmar today. So Japan is growing in strength, and they're looking to extend their sphere of influence throughout East Asia as well. There was another treaty in 1922 that dealt more with East Asia, the Nine-Power Treaty, and this was the issue of the open door policy in China once again. It was agreed upon by all 9 nations attending, And I don't remember exactly the details of this treaty, and significance is that it's not really all that important, other than the fact that it really had no um, enforcement power. And so in 1931, when Japan invaded, the U.S. really couldn't do anything. They invaded through Manchuria, this panhandle of China, or if you see it as more of like a duck, it's the head. Um, okay, so another issue to be considering here in the 1920s, of course, is huge debts. Debts all around because of the war. So look at the debt in blue, loans given by the United States to European states during the war, right? To France and Great Britain, we learned mainly, and also to Italy. Um, and then nations that were in debt to the United States is all of these in peach. So so France and Britain owe the United States a lot of money, and they plan to pay back a lot of that money. How? By getting reparations from Germany. Well, how's Germany going to pay for it, right? So this is the whole thing is like a messed up cycle, and puts a lot of pressure on Germany, and leads to the infamous period of hyperinflation, where inflation was like something 30,000% or something crazy like that. Where in 1914 the number of German marks to the U.S. dollar was 4.2. So a loaf of bread would cost 4.2 marks, for example, if it was today's money. Um, whereas but just 9 years later, 4.2, what is that? A million, billion, trillion. Is it trillion? That's trillion. 4.2 trillion marks to the U.S. dollar. Hyperinflation, and one of the reasons that this happened was that the German government was printing money like crazy to essentially to protest also their the reparations that they had to pay back, which they saw as kind of unfair. This woman here is burning Deutschmarks, or I think they were called Reichsmarks back then, um, to stay warm. That is that the money is literally worth less than the paper is printed on. So a solution had to be hatched out, and the United States actually took the lead in doing that. And they developed something called the Dawes Plan, not to be confused with the Dawes Severalty Act, please, but the Dawes Plan of 1924 was more loans from the United States. We were already on a spending, well, actually no, that the spending spree would come during the Great Depression. But here, $2.5 billion was loaned to Germany, um, as if the Germans aren't in debt already. They were going to go more in debt, right? Yeah, but this time, I mean, it was kind of it was suggested possibly that they wouldn't have to pay back the loans, or not the terms on the loans weren't as strict as what the Allies had against Germany. So with that money, Germany could pay $2 billion in reparations to the Allies, and then the Allies, that's France and Britain, could pay their war debts to the United States. See? This is the Dawes Plan. But again, it further put Germany in debt. There was another one called the Young Plan. I don't remember exactly the details of that, but here in 1930 you can see a propaganda poster that shows Germans. For 3 generations, you'll have to slave away, is what the poster says. Which again, this might be a Nazi poster because it shows them as kind of being victims to these foreigners that are preying on them. So 26, what is that, $1 billion had to be paid over a period of 58 and a half years by the Germans. Something that was just, way too hard of a hardship. So in 1931, President Hoover declared a debt moratorium. That is that for the time being, debts would not have to be paid back. And notice that is already during the Great Depression, and that's why. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about the good neighbor policy, but that's towards Latin America. Google that, look it up. We're going to focus mainly on foreign policy as regards to disarmament, and also our involvement with with Europe and Japan. This is an incredibly important pact or agreement here that was signed in 1928. Very important note card term for you to remember. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was 15 of the world's major nations dedicating themselves to, wait for it, outlawing aggression and war as tools of foreign policy. Oh, so what happens if another nation decides to go to war against you? That's right, you'd probably have to go to war, right? Well, okay, so it was more of a symbolic thing, right? Or it was they were outlawing aggression. Aggression means that you attack first, basically to get what you want. but still, it doesn't have much teeth. 62 nations signed it. The problems, of course, are there are no actual provisions for enforcement, and it gave Americans kind of a false sense of security because things were changing in Germany. The National Socialist Party there was rising, and even before that, problems or alarming events began to happen in East Asia. Japan invaded China in 1931, mainly just this area called Manchuria or Manchukuo, and they made up some kind of excuse that had to do with the bombing of a railroad, which the Japanese might have actually done themselves to create this excuse to invade. But um, they invaded Manchuria, and they had already been occupying Korea since 1910. And there are stories of a lot of atrocities out of Korea as well. The League of Nations condemned it. They wagged their finger, and that's pretty much it. That's all they could do. And Japan basically said, "See you later." So Hoover and Republicans wanted no part in American military action on the other side of the world, and why should they, right? What does that have to do with the United States? And they'd learned their lesson from World War I. 140 some thousand Americans had died. So a doctrine. A doctrine is like, a set of beliefs, right, had developed here by 1932 under President Hoover, and it was about our foreign policy. The U.S. would not recognize any territorial acquisitions that were achieved by force. Clearly, this is directed at whom? It's directed at Japan. So this kind of further sours relations with the United States and Japan. Japan was infuriated because the U.S., of course, had conquered new territories a few decades earlier, the Spanish-American War, right? In 1932, Japan also bombed Shanghai. Lots of casualties there, but that would be nothing compared to what would follow, and I'll have that in a minute here. Back home, more developments here, and here by Republican senators. They held these hearings, and I forget what committee it was called officially, but the person that headed the committee was Senator Nye from North Dakota. And these hearings sought to investigate the charge that the World War I was actually that the U.S. entered it needlessly, and we entered so that munitions factory owners could make huge profits, and they were nicknamed as a result the merchants of death. So the committee did eventually charge that bankers wanted war in order to protect their loans that they'd made to the British and the French, and arms manufacturers wanted to make money. So remember we talked about this back when the Americans were debating whether to enter World War I. So this had claimed that the President Wilson had provoked Germany by sailing into those warring nations' waters, provoked them with their U-boat attacks to attack the United States and drag us into the war. So these hearings would have a great impact on American legislation throughout the late 1930s because they resulted in Congress passing several neutrality acts, because by the 1930s things are shaking up in Europe. Germany has rearmed. They have taken part of Czechoslovakia and then all of Czechoslovakia. Germany will unite with Austria, and then move into what was that area of France where they were not allowed to move into? Anyway, we'll get there. In 1938, this congressman named Lewis Ludlow, Democrat from Indiana, so there were Democrats also opposed to the war, proposed a constitutional amendment that called for a national referendum. That's kind of like those Prop 201s and whatever you see. Literally, if we were going to go to war, the people had to vote on it, and this would be put in the Constitution. This was proposed, and it was introduced a bunch of times. It never actually passed, but you can see that people in both parties want to ensure that we're not dragged into some kind of war again that's orchestrated by either politicians or by bankers or munitions owners or something like that. So what resulted again was 3 neutrality acts, actually 4 of them, but in 1935, 36, and 37, the president proclaimed the existence of a foreign war, or when the president would proclaim the existence of a foreign war, certain restrictions would automatically would go into effect. What kind of restrictions? Well, no arms would be sold to any nation that is at war, whether there are allies or not. So no belligerent nations would receive arms from the United States. No loans or credits would be given to belligerent nations. These are all pretty strict, right? Forbade Americans to travel on vessels of nations at war, We know that's what happened with the sinking of the Lusitania. It was a British ship. A bunch of Americans died. Why? Because the Germans sank it, and they sank it because there were weapons on board, and they were using these passenger vessels to transport weapons sometimes. Non-military goods were to be purchased, must be purchased on what's called a cash and carry basis. That is, the non, and this is non-military goods, when they're bought, they're paid for on the spot and they are picked up by the person purchasing them. They are not shipped by United States ships. This is for belligerent nations. Banned involvement in the Spanish Civil War, which is happening between fascists and communists there. So this really limited the options of the president in a crisis. Of course, this didn't come from the president. This came from Congress, and Congress wanted to ensure that the president didn't do things to drag the United States into the war. So as a result, in the 1930s, the U.S. was not arming in the way that Germany was arming. And in fact, I think our military was smaller than Belgium's at the start of this war, or that might have been World War I, I forget. Here's the smoke rising over Europe, and Uncle Sam looking at it with his hands in his pockets. The Panay incident, unfortunately I don't have time to talk about this, but you can Google it. It further really raised tensions between the United States and Japan. An American vessel was bombed on the Yangtze River in China. So the results were the Japanese interpreted the U.S. tone basically the United States were satisfied with this apology, and they saw the U.S. as kind of like, you know, being cowards. In 1937, however, things escalated really badly in East Asia when Japan invaded China outright. So they were just occupying Manchuria. Now they invaded all of China. And they bombed Shanghai, which is China's largest city. About 100,000 people were killed or injured. This photograph was actually not doctored, but the scene was created. The bombing actually happened, and the baby is actually injured, but the photographer placed the baby there and took the photograph for effect, and it certainly did have effect around the world. It's considered one of the most famous photographs of the century. From there, they moved to Nanking, which is today Nanjing, and the Nanking massacre happened. 200,000 civilians, these are civilians, were essentially murdered, just bayoneted. Figures vary wildly, but maybe 80,000 women were raped as well. It's also called the Rape of Nanking. And this incident in particular has led to really strong animosity still between Japan and China even to today. So in the next slide, I'm going to have some photographs that you might want to just skip over if you don't want to see them, but you saw them last year as well in World History. And these are, you know, you can find them online and stuff. But a lot of these atrocities the Chinese will not forget still. So let's move to Europe. And again, this should be a review for you, so I'm going to move pretty quickly. But in 1935, Hitler denounced the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations and began rearming. At the same time, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia to further spark some nationalist sentiment in Italy as well. In 1936, Germany sent troops into the Rhineland. That's what I was thinking about, which again, both of those things are violations of the Treaty of Versailles. And he sent forces or at least weapons to fight on behalf of the fascists in Spain. And that was under the leader General Franco, who would be a dictator later on in Spain for a while. Later on in 1938, the Anschluss, or the unification with Austria, happens, and officially a treaty is signed between Germany, Italy, and Japan, the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Pact, which forms the Axis, what would be the Axis powers later on. The Munich Agreement basically gives Hitler Czechoslovakia, and this was under the leadership of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. And this is the policy of appeasement, which has been criticized so heavily since then. 1939, Germany sent troops into the rest of all Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement actually just gave Germany the Sudetenland. So all of Czechoslovakia. It was clear now when Hitler did that he was not to be reasoned with, not to be trusted, and any one other aggressive move was going to bring a declaration of war from France and Britain. Really the only two large democracies in Europe. And that is what happened on September 1st, 1939, when Germany marched into Poland. using their war machine, their style of warfare, their blitzkrieg, the lightning war. World War II begins. That is, well, in Europe it does. You could say it already began in East Asia with Japan's conquest of China. So, how does the United States respond? Well, in 1939, a new Neutrality Act, because now our allies, the democracies in Europe, are at war with the fascist nations in Europe. So in response to Germany's invasion of Poland, FDR persuades Congress in a special session to allow the U.S. to aid those European democracies in a limited way. The U.S. could sell weapons to the Europeans on a cash and carry basis. So they would come over and purchase these and for cash and take them away on their own ships. FDR was authorized to proclaim what were called danger zones, which U.S. ships and citizens could not enter for risk of being sunk by German U-boats. The results of this were that aggressors could not send ships to buy U.S. munitions. Aggressors are not Britain and France. They are the ones who are being aggressive, the invaders, basically. So the British and the French could. The U.S. Economy improved as European demands for war goods helped bring the country out of that Roosevelt recession. So what finally officially brought the United States out of the Great Depression that nobody disputes is World War II, really. And America becomes, and this is quoting President Roosevelt, the arsenal of democracy. So isolationism, though, neutrality, was still very, very strong in the United States. Those sentiments were still very much strong in the United States. Here's democracy cast out of Europe and on American shores here now, and she says, stay out of Europe for my sake as well as your own. That is, don't get involved there. It can only do bad. America is the last refuge of democracy. Prominent Americans like Charles Lindbergh was a member of the America First Committee, which sought to keep the United States out of the war, remain neutral, and even the young John F. Kennedy, who would serve in World War II, sent a donation to that organization. So how did the United States respond when France fell to the Nazis and then the Battle of Britain raged? This was the question that you debated in class with your choices presentation. But we spent a lot of money to build up an Air Force and a Navy now. In September 1940, Congress passed an act for the first ever peacetime draft. People were drafted into the military, so they'd signed up for selective service. Remember the Selective Service Act from World War I? And everyone has to do that at 18. And now people were drafted. So men 21 to 35 were registered, and many were called up for 1 year of training. Of course, they weren't sent into combat yet. They were just trained in the military. And what resulted from this was the Lend-Lease Act as well, which was heavily debated, but the United States lent a lot of money, a lot of supplies to various nations, totaling many billions of dollars, over $48 billion in today's money, to our allies to fight the Nazis, basically. So, yes, the stuff was expected to be paid back. After World War II, much of the world was devastated. The United States was pretty much the only country directly untouched by the war. And so things changed forever. The Cold War fully brought the United States out of isolationism forever. In 1941 as well, aboard a ship in the Atlantic Ocean, President Roosevelt met with the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and they signed this agreement, this charter. Some very important stuff in there. That if the United States does enter this war, and for Great Britain as well, that they would make no territorial gains from this war if they were victorious. No territorial gains. Territorial adjustments must be in accord with the wishes of the people concerned. That is, self-determination, right? All peoples have a right to self-determination. Trade barriers should be lowered. There's going to be a global economic cooperation and advancement of social welfare. And then this freedom from want and freedom from fear as well. Freedom of the seas, disarmament of aggressor nations, post-war common disarmament. So what do you think all of this is philosophically, ideologically, a predecessor to? Like, what's going to come out of this, do you think, after World War II? If you said the United Nations, you'd be correct. A global economic cooperation and advancement of social welfare, freedom from want, freedom from fear. How is this all to be achieved? Yeah, so it's going to be the United Nations. By the way, anybody know who this fella is here? He was I think he was the, like the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was the official title. He's basically the head of all the militaries under FDR. His name is George C. Marshall. All right, and then of course December 7th, 1941, the United States is surprised at Pearl Harbor, and we will stop there for today. Thank you for coming, and sorry that these are kind of long. Deal with it.